We're talking a little bit about the time between the Testaments, the Intertestamental Period, Second Temple Judaism. And we're not just talking about that because we love history so much or anything like that, but because we want to understand the New Testament. And we realize that this period of time, a lot of things happened in this period of time that provide the context for the New Testament. And we've said that, and I'm not coming up with this myself, but we've said that there were five major empires, you might say, or I guess it'd be better to say five major groups that controlled Israel during this time. A number of them were empires. Israel wasn't. Israel controlled itself for a period of time during these 400 years. And then there were five major crises. The first empire, Persia. The second empire, Greece. And during this period in which Israel was controlled by the Greeks, there was a major crisis that took place, you might say. And that crisis was the fact that Alexander the Great, he was this ruler of Greece that enabled them to defeat Persia and take over even Palestine. He wanted the whole world to think the way that he did. He wanted the world to be Greek. The title that is given to this spread of Greek culture is called Hellenism. And Hellenism basically meant getting the world to speak Greek, think Greek, and worship Greek. In other words, Alexander would have made a pretty good American, I suppose. He wants the world to be like themselves. He wanted the world to be like himself. And in many ways, Alexander's plan worked. Now, he only lived for a little while himself. And after he died, his empire split apart. And as someone has written, his empire as a political unity did not survive his death in 323 BC. But the cultural empire which he founded lasted for nearly 1,000 years until the rise of Islam and the Arab conquests of the 7th century AD. And we see how that played out in Israel. Greek culture permeated the Mediterranean world, imposing a remarkable degree of oneness on that part of the world. Greek became the common language for business, and it was so common, in fact, that the Old Testament even needed to be translated into Greek. This is why the New Testament was written not in Hebrew, not in Aramaic, but in Greek. And the acceptance or rejection of Hellenization became the most dominating issue in all of life, all of the life in Palestine, and we're going to see that. But Alexander died in around the age of 33 in Babylon, and his empire was divided up among his generals. There were 8 surviving generals, and there was this brutal power struggle among those generals to see who would reign supreme and who would inherit the kingdoms conquered by Alexander, and no one really won. There wasn't another Alexander, and so the empire ended up being divided among the generals. 2 of the most important generals, they were named Ptolemy, Ptolemy, and he was given rule in Egypt, and then there was another whose name was Seleucus. At least that's how I say it. I'm not sure if they would recognize the way I'm pronouncing their names, but he was given rule in Syria. Now, Israel was in between those 2 regions, and for most of the period in which the Greeks ruled it, it was the first general, Ptolemy, and those who followed him who were in charge. Specifically, he ruled over Israel from 320 BC to 198 BC, and historically, their biggest contribution was building up a city called Alexandria, which had this huge library and museum. And we don't know much about how they ruled Israel, but it seems like they followed the basic pattern of Persia and ruled through the high priests. One author writes, the country was controlled by a governor, and the people had to pay taxes to the empire, but Judea itself, which consisted of a restricted area radiating but a few miles from Jerusalem, was organized as a temple state, whose constitution was laid down in the priestly law of the Pentateuch. The high priest, as the head of the temple administration, was head of the internal administration of this tiny Jewish state. There were many Jews outside of Judea, in Babylonia, Asia Minor, in Alexandria, Antioch. Their gifts, their donations, helped maintain the Jerusalem temple and its administration, but only the Jews who lived in Judea came directly under the jurisdiction of the high priest. Of course, for the empires at this time, like any empire, I suppose, the big focus was taxation. They wanted money from everyone. And so Seleucus and those who followed him wanted to take over Palestine, obviously, because they saw this as an opportunity for receiving more money from taxes. And they finally won a battle to take it over in 198 BC. During this period, there was someone named Antiochus who took control of the land where Israel lived. And Antiochus was passionate about Hellenization, and he imposed a process of Hellenization on the Israelites. This process was resisted by a group of Jews who were called the Hasidim, or the pious ones. As Greek culture was being pushed on the Jews, groups like this rose to resist. And one of the most important of those groups was called the Pharisees, or the separated ones. They wanted the people to obey every aspect of Old Testament law. And by the time we meet them in the New Testament, we know what they were like. But this is where they started. They wanted Jews to remain Jews. Now, Seleucid control didn't last long. They were only in charge for about 31 years, from 198 to 167. The reason they weren't able to control Israel for very long was because it was during this time that Rome was coming into power, and eventually they were defeated by Rome in 190. One of the results of this defeat was that the Seleucids, had to pay taxes to Rome. This one empire, the Seleucids, had to pay taxes to the other empire, the greater empire, and they got much of those taxes from Israel. They would get taxes from Israel, and they would pay those taxes to Rome. And so you can imagine that even though this was a short period of time in which this was happening, it was a terrible time for the Jewish people, and it became especially terrible when Antiochus IV took control in 176 BC. One sign this was going to be a problem was the fact that Antiochus called himself Epiphanes, which meant the glorious one. Epiphany means manifestation, or manifestation of God. And so essentially he was saying he was a manifestation of God. The Jews called him by another name, Epiphanies, which meant madman because of his insane behavior. Of course, they didn't say that to his face. Now, interestingly, this is all laid out in Daniel before it happened. Daniel walks through a number of world leaders, and in chapter 11, verses 21 through 25, you can read how he talks about this man before he even came onto the scene. But under Antiochus IV, the Jews had a very difficult time. He had a problem. He had to pay taxes to Rome, and obviously he wasn't wanting to pay those taxes from his own pocket. He wanted to get that money from the people he ruled, and the Jews had their money in the temple. People paid money to the temple, and they put it in what you might describe as the temple bank. Antiochus saw that, and he wanted it. At that point, there was a man named Jason, whose brother was the high priest. Jason wanted to be the high priest because of all the power, and so he bribed Antiochus to get the job. He promised him money and that he would keep making Jerusalem more Greek. But obviously, Antiochus wasn't a good guy, so a couple years later, Jason sent another man named Menelaus to Antiochus to give him his money, and what Menelaus did was increase the bribe and stole the high priesthood from Jason. Now, selling the high priesthood was wrong in the first place, but at least Jason was from the right line of people. There are ancestors that high priests are supposed to come from, but Menelaus wasn't from those ancestors. He was from a different tribe, one that wasn't given the privilege of being the high priest. So this made the Jewish people who knew what was going on very angry, and there was a lot of trouble during this time. Antiochus was from the Syrian line, so he was looking at Egypt, which was under the rule of the other general, not that specific general because he had died a long time, but under the rule of his line, and he wanted it for himself. And so he was starting to try to take it for himself. When the other group saw this, they asked Rome for help, and Antiochus went out to fight. He met the Roman army, who told him he could either retreat or die. He said he wanted to think about it. So the Roman general drew a circle around him and said, "You can think about it as long as you want, but I need an answer before you can move out of this circle." And so he was humiliated. Meanwhile, back in Jerusalem, Jason thought Antiochus was dead, so he took advantage and ousted Menelaus from power. When Antiochus found out, though, he went crazy, and he came to Jerusalem, killing everyone in his way, women, children, everyone. And he went into the temple, and he stole the furniture there, and he started really trying to stop the Jewish people from engaging in the Jewish religion. He thought that was the source of the problem, and he started trying to ban Judaism, which was the third great crisis. He didn't allow anyone to have a copy of the Torah. He didn't allow anyone to get circumcised or celebrate any of the other religious festivals of Judaism. These became capital crimes. You could die for studying the Torah. And then the worst thing he did was dedicate the temple to Zeus. He even put a statue of Zeus in the temple, and he sacrificed a pig on the altar. And this was around 167 to 164 BC. One scholar writes, the temple at this point, still under the control of Menelaus, was turned over to the cult of Zeus, identified with the Syrian deity Baal Shamem, the Lord of Heaven. And the people that didn't fall in line with that were persecuted. We're talking mothers who circumcised their babies were crucified with those babies hanging around their necks. So obviously this was a very heated, terrible time. And at some point, Antiochus sent one of his representatives into a village, and he went to one of the priests and offered him money if he would make a sacrifice to the Greek gods. That priest's name was Mattathias, and he refused. But there was another Jew there who said he would take the money and make the sacrifice. And so Mattathias killed that Jew, and then he killed the representative, and then he fled into the wilderness. This act sparked a movement, a Jewish resistance movement that lasted from 167 to 143 BC, after which they were finally granted independence from Greek rule by the Romans. This time period was called the Maccabean period. It lasted from 167 to 135 BC, and it was named after the third son of Mattathias, Judas, whose nickname was Maccabeus, which means the hammer. And he's a hero in Jewish history. He raised an army which attacked Syria's interests in Palestine, and for 20 years or so, he gave them such problems that they were able to win certain concessions from the rulers until in 164, they finally allowed the Jews to openly practice Judaism, and they reopened the temple for worship. When they reopened the temple, they had a great feast. This took place in the month of December. They called it the Feast of Lights, and it's celebrated to this day. We call it Hanukkah. When the lamps were relit in the temple, many Jews believe that a miracle took place, and it's First Maccabees that tells the story like this. After the Jews had routed their oppressors and regained the right to worship in the temple, they found that the eternal light meant to burn perpetually had been extinguished. When the temple was cleansed of idolatry, only enough uncontaminated oil for the first day of rededication was found, but the cruse of oil miraculously burned for 8 days. On the 8th day, the story goes, more oil had been readied by the priest. Now, whether that miracle happened or not, this was a big moment for the Jews. It reminded them of God's faithfulness to his people. And in the New Testament, we discover that even Jesus celebrated this holiday in John 10. After Judas, there were two brothers who followed him, who won full freedom for Israel. And as a result, the Jews gave the third brother the high priesthood and more. Basically, they made him king. He didn't call himself that, but he acted like it, and he used his power to his own advantage. It's kind of the typical story, I suppose. He started off fairly good, but he got power, started using that power in ugly ways, which only got worse in the generations that followed him. And we see how bad it got. Looking at one particular descendant named Alexander, who ruled from 103 to 76, he ruled so badly that the Jews who were living there wanted someone else to take over. He showed, one scholar says, no concern for anything but personal power and military conquest. In his unquenchable thirst for this way of life, he hazarded his nation's independence more than once, exhausted the national wealth, and forfeited the respect and goodwill of the best elements of the nations. And so they rebelled and asked for Syrian help. They went to war against Alexander, and he was about to be defeated, and we don't know why, but at a pivotal moment, some of the Jews who opposed him switched back to his side, and he narrowly escaped being defeated. But he became so angry that he went back to a feast with his concubines and had 800 of his enemies crucified, and their wives and children. And while they were being crucified, he had their wives and children's throats slit at their feet. When he died, he gave his kingdom to his wife Salome. And when she died, her oldest son became high priest. He wasn't very ambitious, but the younger son was. And so he fought for the high priesthood. The two sons battled for rule. In the middle of that battle, one son, the oldest son, looked to Rome for help. His name was Hyrcanus the second, and as I said, he wasn't very ambitious, but someone behind him was. His name was Antipater, and it was Antipater actually that motivated him to go to Rome. Now, Rome had been rising in power for about 100 years, and when they heard what was happening and they decided to come to Palestine, they were led by a man named Pompey. They were coming, though, to give power to the younger brother, but somehow in the middle of that process, that brother offended them, and Rome decided to just come in and take over completely. I mean, it took some time, but there was a battle. But eventually they won, and they even stormed the temple. One of Pompey's acts was especially shocking. When he captured the temple area in Jerusalem, he entered the holy house and went into the Holy of Holies itself, the throne room of Israel's God, which was barred to all access except once in the year on the Day of Atonement when the high priest entered in. And so this pagan soldier forcing his way into the temple, despite the protests of the priests, was an unspeakable sacrilege, as one scholar explained. And I'm relaying all these stories because I'm just trying to give you a feel for the tension in the time of Jesus, because this is about 63 BC when Rome takes over, and their rule lasts all the way through the days of Jesus. And we'll look at this a little more carefully in our next video.